All right. So let me pray, and we'll keep going. God, we give you thanks for the chance to be back together on these Wednesdays to study your word, and we ask that as we look at the people that were there at the cross with Jesus, that we might uncover some things about ourselves and about the truth you have for us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so the first week we're going to talk about Pilate, Pontius Pilate, and we're going to talk about what we know about him and kind of what we understand about him and then kind of what he means, each of these characters. Today we'll talk about, there's part 1 and part 2 of today, and so today will be 2 characters, and we'll spend some time with each one of them, but the rest of the time there'll be, could be groups of people, but there won't be 2 individuals that we'll look at, all right? So we're going to talk about Pontius Pilate first, and this is what we know about Pontius Pilate. We know that his name was Pontius Pilate. That's the one thing we do know. That's all we know. One of the things we can know about it. We know he was the man who handed Jesus over to be crucified. We know his story is a man caught in a lot of a dilemma. We don't know, no matter how many times we read the story, exactly what he thought about things and what he really felt and all that kind of situation. It's kind of an interesting character as we read some of his stuff and study some of the stuff about who he is. So that's what we know about Pilate. Not a lot. We know that he was a person who was he was the one who handed Jesus over to be crucified, and that happened because he was the governor of Judea. That's what the gospel writers call him, the governor of Judea. His actual title, his Roman title, was prefect. In the Roman system, prefects were kind of middle-class men who owned a little bit of property, and so they would be assigned by someone in Roman hierarchy that owed them a favor, and they would be assigned to small little areas to kind of watch over them, and anything that, especially those that they determined needed kind of some special attention, and so they would do that. And so he was the prefect in that area. He was the 5th prefect of Judea. Let me go back again. I jumped too far. It's going the wrong way. Hold on. I'm figuring this out. It's new technology. All right. He was the 5th prefect of Judea, and that was the fifth person that the Romans had assigned there. He was personally appointed by Emperor Tiberius in AD 26. He made his headquarters in the Roman city of Caesarea. Caesarea is an interesting city. It's a seaside town, and when you're there, you look, and there's lots of the beginning of some aqueducts and everything else that took water throughout the Roman kind of area, and it's a neat little place of a lot of ruins and things like that. But it was obviously a very ornate city. It was a city that was where Herod had built this palace, and so that's where it was. And so that's where he was staying there in the Roman city of Caesarea when he was in the area. The main job of a Roman provincial governor or a prefect was to keep things under control, to collect taxes, and to keep the peace. He was basically there to be the eyes and the ears of the Roman government, so that they would watch out over them, and if there was any kind of trouble going on, they would let some Roman official, some Roman Centurion or soldier know about what was going on, and they would handle it. They didn't really handle a lot. They just kind of kept things under control. They collected the taxes. They didn't actually do it. They just made sure they got done. And just like when we talk about tax collectors, like Matthew the tax collector or anything else, we talk about them. There was a certain amount of tax that the Romans said you had to collect, and then there was they could add on top of that to pad their own wallets. That's kind of how they did that. And then they were there to keep the peace, to make sure that nobody kind of messed up. That was kind of their job. In order to do that, they kind of made certain kind of Roman allowances to things that happened. They let the local people do a couple of things. They most of the time let them keep their own religious customs. Now, this became a problem for Christianity as Christianity began to develop, because the Christians said that Jesus was Lord and the Romans said Caesar is Lord, and so that became a point of real contention between the two. and they began to kind of know that was happening. But they also kind of let them manage their own affairs. So Pilate had come from Rome to Israel about 7 years before the story of Jesus' death takes place. He was kind of a typical Roman. When he arrived, he really didn't know anything about Jewish laws and Jewish customs. And from what we know about him and what we hear about him in history books and other places like that, he really didn't do a lot to change that. I mean, he didn't care about them. He was there to do his job and to make himself look good and feel like he's important. And he really didn't care what was going on with the Jewish people. And so he didn't kind of learn to know that. What we know about him and what we heard about him is that Pilate despised the Jews, and they returned the favor. The Jews despised Pilate. History and the scriptures record several unfortunate incidents that happened during this time. Some of them had needless bloodshed, and there was a lot of kind of weird harassment kind of things that happened with the people, and they kind of made certain groups kind of feel bad and all that kind of stuff, which made the Jews kind of look at Pilate as this cruel and heartless man who really didn't care about them, and that's kind of who he was. That's kind of what was happening there. So he's there, and all that's happening. It is Passover season in Jerusalem, and so Pontius Pilate is in Jerusalem because it's Passover season. If he was to go back to Rome or to go anywhere else to kind of get away, he would have to be there during Passover season because that's when the most people were in his city, and there could have been the most possibility for problems, and so he had to be on the lookout for things that are happening. So no doubt, again, he's staying in Herod's place there at Caesarea Philippi. Herod is in town too, even though technically this isn't his area, because it is a big week to be in Jerusalem with Passover week. It's an important week, and so people are coming from all over the countryside to be there, and they're doing that. Interestingly, Palm Sunday is the story of when we tell about how Jesus got into Jerusalem that week. Rode in on the back of a donkey, waving the palm branches and shouted Hosanna and welcomed him in, and kind of this humble kind of ride into town. What we know from kind of the history books is that on the other side of town, there was another parade that happened that Herod was kind of coming into town. And he was coming into town on the back of a white stallion, and he was coming with all the pomp and the circumstance, probably trumpets and fanfare and chariots and everything else, Roman centurions, all this stuff was happening. He's riding into town to all this stuff. So it's kind of a real comparison, real kind of juxtaposition between the humility and the simplicity of Jesus and the pomp and the circumstance of Herod. And that really kind of sets the stage for a lot of things that are going to happen through the course of the week. We know the high priests are there. There's Annas, who's the old high priest, and Caiaphas, the current high priest. They become important figures because Jesus has to stand trial before each of them, and so they're there. And again, we know that thousands of Jewish pilgrims were in town because they've come from all parts of Israel and surrounding areas, if they're Jewish, to celebrate the Passover. And a lot of times, just like when you go see a parade, you're out here for the Christmas parade in town, and there's people who come from all over the place because they want to sell, they push their cart uptown, they want to sell their balloon animals and their noisemakers and their cotton candy and all that kind of stuff. And they may not be from Lebanon, but they're here because there's a party, there's a parade, and they have a chance to make some money. And that would have been the case in Jerusalem too. There would have been vendors that would have showed up to sell their wares and do that stuff just because they knew that there were a lot of people in town for that. Just like we would do when you go anywhere today to kind of for a festival or celebration. Someone else is in town. Jesus is there with his disciples, and that again becomes important because that's where the collision starts to happen pretty quick. So all the players in this week are assembled. They're all gathered in town, and this final kind of drama begins. We don't really know how much Pilate knew about Jesus, but we can assume that he knew something about him because that was his job as governor, is to know what was going on. And so he probably heard about Jesus because Jesus had gained a lot of popularity with the common people. He gained a lot of disfavor with some of the religious leaders of the Jewish people, but he gained a lot of favor with some of the common people. And so he probably heard a lot about Jesus, but maybe probably had never met Jesus or knew Jesus or seen Jesus until when he's brought before Pilate. So Pilate is kind of we don't know how much he knew about Jesus. But he must have heard pretty quickly that the chief priests and the scribes that bring Jesus to Pilate really had no use for him at all. But he probably heard a lot of rumors about him flying around the countryside. And one of the things that happens with Pilate as we get into the story is that Pilate begins to understand that Pilate's wife kind of must have heard more about this Jesus, maybe from her maid or something else that was a commoner or more common person, but we don't know. And she kind of knew about this, and then she had a dream about this and all this kind of stuff. But she kind of warns Pilate, you don't want to mess with this guy. This guy's pretty big deal. And we know Pilate didn't listen to that, so that's it. But it's the job of the politician to know what was going on, and we'll see that in a lot of ways Pilate is a smart politician, and he kind of always knew which way the wind was blowing. So this is kind of how the events happen that bring Pilate into the conversation. This is what happens when Jesus gets arrested. He's arrested somewhere around midnight on Thursday night. Jesus has just been with the disciples in the upper room. They've gone out to the Garden of Gethsemane. He's prayed. They come and they arrest Jesus because Judas has betrayed him, and they take him to be a trial. First, he has to go to a hearing before Annas, the old high priest. And then he goes before Caiaphas, the new high priest. Annas, which probably shows you some of the struggle for power that I worked for a guy who ran for bishop one year. He was my senior pastor, and I was his associate pastor. And he was up for bishop at general conference one year, or jurisdictional conference. And he used to tell me, he said, I really don't want to be bishop. I want to be a retired bishop. That's where the real power is. And there's kind of like, I don't want to be high priest. I want to be retired high priest, because that's where I get all the influence without any of the work, basically, is what they were saying, And that's kind of Annas. But they have to go before he does Annas, but then he has to go for Caiaphas, because Caiaphas is the one with the influence, with the power, even without the influence. And so that happens too. And then he has to go to a hearing before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is kind of like the Jewish Supreme Court. It was kind of a check and balance, so that the high priest couldn't just run roughshod over the system, that they at least had to have something else, although it was kind of almost a rubber stamp kind of situation in this case and everything else. They tried to pin a charge of blasphemy on Jesus. Blasphemy is kind of where you take credit for something that only God can take credit for. You've taken credit for something, and it's not yours to take credit for it. God can do this. And so that was some of the statements that Jesus makes about himself and about what he's doing, kind of lead them to think that he's doing this because he said, he's comes from God. And so they call that. And a lot of people said that. A lot of people said they were the Son of God. That would have not been unique. But some of the ways in which Jesus said it, and because Jesus created a following, and they didn't. Even when we look at Barabbas, who's the next person we'll look at today, even when they have these other leaders and other military people and less than ethical people, they all kind of made claims about themselves. And Jesus wasn't the only one who said he would have claimed to be the Messiah in that day. So it would not have been unique to him. And so they were kind of used to shutting these people down. But usually they could do it with a little bit more of a threats and threat of punishment rather than taking it to the extreme. Sometimes he wasn't the only one that was done to do that. But blasphemy was a charge that was also punishable by death. It was a religious charge, not a political charge, even though it was politically religious. It was not a Roman political charge. It was a Jewish kind of charge. And they wanted an execution of Jesus because he was doing this. They didn't want to give him a fair trial. But there's only one hitch. For all the things that the Romans would allow Jews to do, they would not allow them to carry out a death sentence. They could condemn a man to death, but they couldn't carry it out. The Romans had kind of taken that right away from them. So before Jesus could be put to death, Pilate has to agree to it, and that's why he gets brought into the thing. And so this is what happens on He brought to the Praetorium. The Praetorium was the judgment hall where Pilate would sit. It was, we know from the story and how it goes, it was located kind of next to his home because his wife was there and she'd kind of come out from their residence and kind of done all stuff. So it was not like far away, but he was brought to the Praetorium. Interestingly, kind of a side note here, when we talk about Jesus being arrested and put in jail and all that kind of stuff, and being held for the trial, we think of being put in jail as like you're put behind bars and they lock the door, right? That wasn't the way it was. For Jesus, there's a house that's right outside the walls of Jerusalem that they think is where some of these Roman officials live, and at times, and they underneath the house there's a kind of a cave dug out, and it's got these really smooth limestone walls, and it's pretty deep, and there's a hole in the top of it about this big, and all they would do is they would tie a rope around somebody underneath their arms, and they would lower them down inside this hole, and they would take the rope up. Well, the walls were slick limestone. You couldn't climb up the walls, so you were basically imprisoned there, but there weren't bars, there weren't doors. It was just, you couldn't get out. And so that's kind of where they think Jesus was kind of put in prison before he does that. But he's brought to the Praetorium. It's now about Friday morning at 6 or 7, between 6 or 7 in the morning, and all the people are there. The chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, they're all there, and they had Jesus kind of bound up like a criminal, and they brought him to Pilate at the Praetorium. So it's Friday morning, and this is what happens on Friday morning. Jesus is brought before Pilate. All four Gospels agree to the first questions that Pilate asked Jesus. He starts to ask him, "What are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate went back inside. He called Jesus over by himself, kind of in the middle of all this stuff, and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews? They keep saying that you are. Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Are you asking this on your own, or did someone tell you this about me?" Jesus is really asking Pilate, "Are you making some statement of faith here about who I am, or are you just listening to what other people are saying about me?" And I can imagine for Jesus, that was probably a question he felt like he would ask a lot of times, because it was like, even back to when you think about can anything good come out of Nazareth, when Nathaniel and they're all there, they're asking those questions. It's like, until I see for myself, until I can make this, I can't understand it. I don't want to just I don't want to believe because I've heard other people say at some point I have to make that decision for myself. For us as United Methodists, that's what we're doing right now, kind of with our confirmation class. We're inviting those students whose parents may have made a decision for them when they had been baptized or brought to the church during their childhood. But now when they reach this age, we ask them to, all right, don't just come because somebody else told you about this. What are you going to make? Are you going to make this decision for yourself? And that's kind of what that comes, and that's what he's asking him. And Pilate says, I'm not a Jew. And as if that was the difference. You could only make that statement if you were Jewish. Basically, I think Pilate more says, well, I'm Roman, so I'm not going to even consider this. Your own people and the chief priests that brought you, they told me about this. What have you done? Like, what in the world, what have you done that could possibly make them this mad at you, that they want you to hand you over to me? So that's kind of what Pilate starts to ask in the first question he asks. That's when the Jewish leaders were saying about Jesus, and Pilate wants to know. It means something different to the Jewish people, king of the Jews. It means something totally different when you're the Roman leader, because to claim that you're a king is a much bigger deal, because only Caesar was king, and so that was kind of a big deal. So when that happens, Jesus starts to answer that, and he starts to kind of answer a deliberately ambiguous way. It is as you say, he says, meaning I'm a king, but not the kind of king you're thinking of. Well, was he a king? Was he not a king? Pilate still didn't know. John gives some details kind of that others admit. He says, my kingdom does not originate in this world. If it did, the guards would fight, so I wouldn't have to been arrested by the Jewish leaders. My kingdom is not from here. And that's a kind of a big deal. But he answers kind of ambiguously. You say I'm a king, man. My kingdom is not from here, so I'm not the same kind of king you're thinking I'm a kind of king. The chief priests are really out to confuse Pilate. They really want to know kind of what's going on there. So that's kind of where they're at. And then Pilate asked a second question of Jesus that happened. So you are a king, Pilate answered. And Jesus says, well, I'm a king, but not the way you're thinking of a king. My kingdom was born, came in this world for a reason. Testify to the truth. Whoever accepts the truth listens to my voice. And so Pilate then asked that second question, what is truth? What is truth? And so that's Pilate's second question to Jesus. And so we know that, and the questions become this. Was this question a wistful desire to know the truth? Was it a philosophical kind of a question? That's a Roman kind of way to answer that question. Was it a mocking or simply kind of purely ignorant? Was he irritated or indifferent? Was he speaking from a deep need within? I mean, what was the reason why Pilate started asking this question? What is truth? All kinds of people, when you're thinking about it, if you're in that position in a Roman system in that day, all kinds of people were telling you all kinds of things about what was happening. The Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, the scribes, the Pharisees, all those people were telling you this is the truth. The Roman leaders were telling you, no, Pilate, you got to watch this. This is the truth. And now Jesus is telling them this is the truth. So Pilate's going, well, what is truth? Everybody has a different story, and I don't know what to even listen to sometimes. And so they kind of have this kind of thing that happens, and so he kind of do that. There's no way to know with certainty why Pilate asked that question, but this much we know is that at that very moment, Pilate was standing closer to the truth than he'd ever been before in his life, and he would ever be again. And then that brief moment passes, and the Jewish leaders begin to accuse Jesus. The Bible says very clearly that Jesus gave no answer, not even a single charge, so that Pilate was very confused. And that's why I said Pilate what we know about Pilate is a man caught in a dilemma. Who is this man? Why is he here? And why did these people want to have Jesus killed? And it says that after this he went out and he went out and let me go ahead and go forward a little bit more. After this, he said he went out to the Jews again and asked them, I can't find any case against him. I don't see any reason why we should punish him. But they have a custom that I release a prisoner for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? Do you want me to release them? And they cried out, no, that they wanted to do that. They wanted to have they want Jesus to be crucified. Yes.
Okay, so this has troubled me for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I see nothing wrong with the man. You want me to release him?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why wouldn't you if there's nothing wrong with him?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sounded weird.
I think Pilate's caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. He doesn't see any reason why to do it, but he knows that he is going to create for himself problems. He doesn't really. I think ultimately he doesn't ultimately care about. He's not concerned about who Jesus is. But he knows that if he releases Jesus, that he's made all these other people mad, and he's going to have to deal with this crowd of people out here. And that is more of a threat to him than anything else that's happening here.
Took the easy way out.
Yeah, he takes the easy way out. That's kind of where it is. And that's it. So there's a Passover custom that Pilate releases a prisoner each year. The catch was that the people had to agree. Pilate didn't get to decide. The people had to agree. It wasn't his choice. So he offered them a choice. You can almost see the light going on there. You were talking about in Pilate's brain about, I had an idea. Maybe if I offer them to release this guy, then they'll let that happen. He could use the situation to kind of get around everything else out. So he offered them two men. He offered them Jesus, and he offered them Barabbas. And that's where we're going to go. We're going to talk about Barabbas as our next character kind of thing. Yes? And then we go to the story where while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife said to him, have nothing to do with this innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal about him in a dream. So they're all kind of conflicted in this story. Pilate, his wife, they're all kind of conflicted in this about what happened. And so what are we going to do? And so you're right. I think they took the easy way out. They decided what they were going to do, and that was kind of how it worked. And so Pilate kind of does this. Let's see. We're going to go ahead and. Let me go back because I want to do one of them. Pilate did four things in this situation. All right, Pilate made 4 attempts to release Jesus. All right, he told the Jews to try the case themselves. He sent the case to Herod. Herod said, "It's not my concern. Herod probably said, you handle this. This is why you're here. This is why I let you stay in my palace for you to do this. I'm not going to mess with this." And then he tried to satisfy the Jews by scourging Jesus instead of crucifying him. He thought, well, if I beat this guy, then surely they won't ask for him to be killed. But that didn't work either, so that's kind of how that worked. And then he tried to make a deal with the people to choose Barabbas instead.
So Herod put on it because he was a Galilean and that wasn't his province?
Yes, I think Herod said, this is, and probably he's said, like, if you're to make a decision and you don't want to make a decision, and so you go to your boss and you say, "Hey, I don't," and your boss looks at you and says, "Look, this is your decision to make. You need to make this decision." I think Herod has standing in Roman culture. Pilate probably doesn't have much standing. He's, like I said, a middle class property owner that's given a privilege. He probably doesn't have near as much standing as Herod does. So Herod said, "You have to make the decision. I'm not getting involved here. This is not my area. This is your area. And if you can't handle this," basically he probably says, "then we'll find somebody who can. But it's not going to be me." And that's kind of how it's not his area. He's not supposed to decide about it. Even though he had a palace in the area and everything else, it's not kind of his area to do that. So he's kind of doing that. And ultimately, what became the thing was that it says from then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." The Jewish leaders did not care about this at all. That was not their concern. They just knew that if I told Pilate, "Hey, you're no friend of Rome if you don't do this," then Pilate's going to say, "Well, I got to do this because I want to prove to everybody I'm a friend of Rome." And so that's there. So that's where we go. So Pilate knew 4 things. He knew he never understood Jesus, but he never wanted to put Jesus to death. Pilate knew that the Jews had an ulterior motive. He wasn't fooled by their pious play to Roman law. He knew Jesus was innocent. But he also knew that releasing Jesus would be really expensive, that he would cost him something, and so he wasn't going to do that. And so he wanted to do that. So that's kind of how that happened. Interesting enough, when we think about Pilate, we got the Apostles' Creed, right? Now, the Apostles' Creed mentions 2 people by name besides God and Jesus, the Holy Spirit, right? And that is the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Pontius Pilate. The only 2 people that are mentioned by name in the Apostles' Creed, which is the basic statement the early church set up to kind of know this is what you believe about to be a Christian. And so one of our creedal statements of faith. So if we take that into account, that's very interesting that Pilate became such an important figure in the story of the death of Jesus that he gets named in the creedal statements of the early church. And so that's kind of that becomes kind of important thing. His name is right there. Virgin Mary and Pontius Pilate. Those are the two names that are right there in the middle of that. All right? So the question becomes, we have to answer Pilate's question, what am I going to do with Jesus? I can crown him. I can say, oh, you are the King of the Jews, or I can crucify him. We are oftentimes faced with Pilate's decision. We have to do that. All right? What will you do with Jesus? That's our question. All right. So, I tell you what, that took a little longer than I thought, so we probably will not get too far into Barabbas today because there's a lot in there too. So I don't want to kind of get too far now. I may skip that and pick that up next week when we do our time. So because I'm afraid if I get into Barabbas, it'll take me a little longer than about 15 minutes or so to finish that up because there's a lot of material in there. We talked about Pilate a little bit more than I had planned on, but it kind of happened. And the other ones are shorter, so it'll fit. What questions do you have about Pilate?
That one about the Sanhedrin. Why couldn't they put Jesus to death? They put Stephen to death a year or two after this.
Yeah, they did, but they were not. The stoning was not a death sentence necessarily.
Was for Stephen.
It was for Stephen. It was for Stephen. You're right.
The result of stoning.
But stoning wasn't necessarily a death sentence. In fact, stoning wasn't that they lined you up against the wall and they threw stones against you either. Stoning was really that they usually dug a hole and they rolled a big stone on top of you, and you were crushed. But you weren't necessarily
death sentence to me.
and you often did die, but it wasn't considered a death penalty. It was considered a corporal or physical punishment. And so you were oftentimes stoned, but you could be stoned to death, or you could be stoned and you ended up dying. And so there were other people that were often stoned and didn't die, but so it wasn't necessarily the same kind of punishment. And I don't think they would have thought that probably the kind of punishment they wanted to level against Jesus would not rise to the level of where they wanted to punish Jesus for.
But Stephen and Jesus were accused of the same crime, blasphemy.
I don't think Stephen was thought of in the same. I don't think they thought Stephen was going to do as much damage as they thought Jesus was going to do. I guess is what I would say. Yeah, but they were not allowed at the time to carry that out. And I don't know. I mean, I haven't done that research to know what happened in that time frame, but I mean, there could have been a change in that understanding of things and what they were allowed to do, because there were some changes, some different things that happened with who was in leadership in different places and different provinces and different stuff like that. So I mean, it could have been that they were, well, we're just going to let you do that, and maybe we don't know. I don't know. I have to research in history books to find this out. Was after Pilate was forced to do this? Was he like, we got to get this is an allowance? We got to give them the freedom to be able to do some of this stuff because I don't want to. We don't need to have to make this decision again. I don't know. I don't know, but they were not. That was not going to. I think that's why Pilate thought if I just scourge Jesus, then that's going to be enough, and they're gonna beat Jesus and scourge him. That's going to be enough for him to satisfy them. But that was not what they wanted. They wanted. And that when they made their charge was that, but also the charge that they made when they said to him, "You're no friend of Rome if you don't do this." That changes the charge just a little bit to kind of give some more kind of depth to the understanding of what probably he was trying to punish him for. But I don't know. It's interesting, but that's what we know from all the stories we hear is that they're not allowed to do that. So they wanted to have Pilate do it. And they probably didn't want to. The other side of it is that there was probably a lot of sense in which, while they wanted him to be put to death, they wanted to pass it off to be on somebody else because Jesus had a lot of popularity. He had a lot of following. And so if I get the Romans to carry this out, then we're better off than if we have to carry this out. And so there's probably a little bit of that kind of motivation in there too. I would imagine. So.
Was there any career effect to Caiaphas or Pilate after this? Did it hurt, 3 years later they kicked him out because, or was it still too new to have?
I will let you know exactly what happens in the next little bit next week when we get together. I'll find it. I'll make sure I got that exactly down because there's a couple of different theories out there. And I just want to make sure I've got all the facts around it before I tell you one thing or another. So. All right.
Why do you think it was important to the early church to include Pontius Pilate in the creed? I was just curious.
Right. No, I think.
Is it choices? Because Mary made a choice. We say she made a choice, but she said,
Yes.
"Let it be unto me
Yeah.
as you have decreed."
That's a good thought.
Pontius Pilate made a choice.
Right.
He had a choice. He could have said, "I'm not doing this,"
Right.
but he chose that route. I just wondered why.
That's a good choice. I also think it marks a time frame because we can
His beginning
marry
and his end.
beginning and end. It kind of gives that, and also I think we can, with all the other stuff that's out there, we can date a lot more stuff when there's Roman officials named Old Testament and New Testament when there's different world political figures, kings, and everything else. We can date some of this stuff of these stories more than we can when they're just given the religious figures out there. Because
So when was the Apostle Creed actually created?
it's
It's
the official last date, and I'll look that up because I can't remember that date. I knew that at one point in my life, and I don't know that anymore. But let me look that up real quick because that's an important question. It is much later, and so that's kind of
Who wrote it specifically?
it's a group of people to get together in the early church that were, and it was set out to make. Let me do this real quick. Yeah, that's what I thought. 340. So it's after Constantine kind of establishes Christianity in the Roman world as more of a okay religion, and so they kind of. But what the creeds, the Nicene, the Apostles' Creed, different things like that were happening when they were starting to be written. They were written because there were a lot of people who had very weird ideas about who Jesus was, and they wanted to kind of. You can believe a lot of things, but you got to believe these things. Is basically what they were saying. And a lot of it was the idea that Jesus wasn't really fully man and fully divine, and he was just this divine being that didn't have this kind of a ghost, kind of a spiritual being that floated around the world, and that was kind of an idea that they wanted to establish. So that's why one of the reasons why things like born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius, some of that stuff gets in there because that defines he's a physical body. Or over against kind of a spiritual kind of a being. It kind of established him as a physical body. So that's probably one of the reasons why it was in there. But it's
and a specific Jesus.
Yes,
Because that
was a common name. In fact, one of the things we'll get into next week, that we'll get into this week, that we'll get into next week, but with Barabbas is that tradition says that Barabbas' first name was Jesus as well. So, that's a very interesting kind of a. And again, is that accurate? Is that as they say? Is that truth or is that apocryphal? I don't know. That's a disparaging statement. So I really shouldn't say that because that makes statements about apocryphal books of the Bible. So I shouldn't say that. But it's just interesting that there's all this stuff going on, and it kind of allows us to kind of look. Pilate dates the story because it's something outside of that world. Mm-hmm.
And it would be noted in records and property records or whatever.
Yeah, they would know. You would know when Herod was there. You would know when Pontius Pilate was there. You'd be able to know those things because they would talk about that. Now, the only challenge to that is that there were times when Herod Antipas would be there, and then Herod, his son would be there. Herod, and his son would be there, and his grandson would be there, and they would all be Herods. And so sometimes that gets kind of in history books. That gets kind of confusing because sometimes we read things and we're like, "Oh, that's the day of this guy." Well, yeah, but that was actually the son or the father. That was not the person we're looking at. And it can get kind of confusing because they're not as clear about dates. Also because our calendars are not the same in all ways. They've changed over the time and adjusted, and so it does kind of affect some of that stuff. But. All right. Well, thank you all very much.